So hi everybody, I'm Dan Rockmore, Director of the William H. Neukom Institute for Computational Science here at Dartmouth College. And on behalf of the college and the Neukom Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's winter Donoho Colloquium, Spyware, Big Brother, and How to Sleep at Night from Dr. Ron Deibert. The Donoho Colloquium is an ongoing series of public lectures aimed at increasing awareness of the many important and sometimes surprising places in which computational ideas are shaping our lives. These events are made possible by a generous gift from David, Mickey, and Dan Donoho in honor of Dan's graduation as a member of the class of 2006. It's a central piece of the larger mission of the Neukom Institute, whose aim is to support and integrate computational thinking and computational ideas throughout the Dartmouth community. The Institute itself is made possible by the generosity of Bill Neukom, Dartmouth class of 64, and a former trustee of the college. A theme in many of the Donoho colloquia is the uneasy relationship that exists between the productive and pernicious capabilities that computational science has enabled. The digital advances that enable the rapid prototyping of heart valves and jewelry are the same that make it possible to build a gun in your basement. The algorithms and technologies that allow you to create amusing videos, professional-looking images, and let you sing like Beyonce are the same ones that make possible supporting materials for fake news and inflammatory rhetoric, not to mention, when turned back toward you, can make you the subject of digital manipulation. Indeed, this complex dialectic is perhaps most apparent in the world of surveillance, where we continually stumble along the blurry boundary between keeping people safe and intruding on their privacy, a tension that will always exist in any free society. The more that we want easy and continuous access to each other and our information, the more that we create opportunities for others to observe us. Access works both ways. Some of this lack of privacy is literally the price of doing business. It's what you agree to in order to participate in online marketplaces, be a part of virtualized communities, and take advantage of powerful digital tools. We surrender much for the sake of convenience and perhaps because we feel protected by legal oversight of the business world. But who will oversee the overseers? As it turns out, governments and even in some cases law enforcement can also exploit technology on your devices. They're not so interested in making people the target of ads, but rather the target of more nefarious and destructive activities. As recent events have shown us, these kinds of actions can be deployed nation on nation and also nation on person. Thus, in some cases, ironically, the role of overseer is left to the citizen, and at the risk of getting up on a soapbox, to those of us in the academy who are able to use resources, whether they be large or small, and the security of tenure as a platform for research into the reach and ramifications of digital technology on our rights and freedoms. The work of today's speaker, Dr. Ron Deibert, embodies these kinds of principles. Ron is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and also director of the Citizen Lab at the university's Munk School of Global Affairs. Citizen Lab is an externally funded interdisciplinary center that works at the nexus of digital technologies, global security, and human rights. It can be seen as an extraordinary model of what we in the academy can do when we want to engage with the world. Professor Deibert has published numerous articles, chapters, and books on issues related to technology, media, and world politics. Among these are the co-authored landmark reports Tracking GhostNet and Shadows in the Cloud, which documented two separate major global cyber espionage networks, and the Great Cannon Report, which documented a new offensive cyber weapon co-located with China's Great Firewall. His most recent book is Black Code: Inside the Battle for Cyberspace. In addition to his research and writing, Professor Deibert presently serves on multiple editorial boards, including those of the journals International Political Sociology and the Journal of Global Security Studies. He is also on the advisory boards of the organizations Access Now, Privacy International, and PEN Canada, and is on the technical advisory groups of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the board of directors of Open Effect, and the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy. Professor Deibert has a long list of honors, of which the most recent speaks best to this evening's lecture. In 2013, he was appointed to the Order of Ontario and awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for being, quote, among the first to recognize and take measures to mitigate growing threats to communications rights, openness, and security worldwide. In light of current and ongoing events, both here and around the world, such a focus of energy, attention, and intellect has perhaps never been more important. And so we are so very fortunate to have with us today one who has made such concerns his life's work, sharing his thoughts on these grave issues. Please join me in welcoming our spring Donoho Colloquium speaker, Professor Ron Deibert.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that introduction. I was going to suggest that maybe he should give the lecture because it was really well done. And thank you all for coming here. Thanks to the Donoho family and to everyone at the Neukom Institute for making this a possibility. I'm really glad to come here and have a chance to talk with you all about the work that we do at the Citizen Lab. Just to begin, I'll set forth what is essentially the thesis of my talk, and that is civil society, which I would define as anything but the private sector in the state, so journalists, humanitarians, human rights organizations, probably a lot of people in this room, and certainly myself as an academic, are facing what I would call a digital assault. There's a real problem that's going on that we're finding on the basis of our research that we've done over the last 10 years, and I think that problem is being ignored. We used to associate digital technologies with thriving civil society. I think that's been the conventional wisdom, but we're seeing quite the opposite, and that really disturbs me. I think, frankly, insofar as civil society is being neutralized or hampered in various ways, increasingly so, then that's a problem for liberal democracy, because civil society, a thriving civil society, is at the heart of liberal democracy. Let me tell you a bit about the Citizen Lab. So Citizen Lab is an unusual place within the university. I'm a political scientist, as Dan said. Most of the people that work for me are technologists. We do look at digital security issues, but not just any digital security issues or cybersecurity issues. We're not necessarily interested in Internet of Things, although obviously that's very important. We focus on issues that arise out of human rights concerns. So we've done a lot of research looking at surveillance. We've documented patterns of internet censorship worldwide. At one point, as part of our contribution to the Open Net Initiative project, we were tracking internet censorship in more than 70 countries on an annual basis. We're very interested these days in mobile privacy and security. I have researchers who are reverse engineering applications to find out whether they contain maybe some hidden censorship or surveillance functionality. And we do a lot of work on what we call targeted digital attacks, which is essentially cyber espionage, espionage against civil society, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. The signature of the lab is our mixture of methods. We combine techniques, skills, tradecraft from computer science, engineering, science, political science, area studies, law. We're not an activist or advocacy group, and this is important to state, I think, reasons I hope will become apparent throughout my talk. I think people confuse the fact that we focus on these issues to think that we're some kind of activist group. I even have colleagues say that, oh, your Citizen Lab does activist stuff, and it's really just the subject matter. No, we do very careful, evidence-based, peer-reviewed research, and that's very important to underscore the legitimacy of the reports that we publish and make sure that they have important effect. We've been described as a kind of CSI of human rights. I don't watch that television show, but I get it. I get why people describe it that way, and I think if that helps you understand what we're about, then so be it. I'll begin here. In the area of targeted digital threats, we often begin with a patient zero, and this is definitely one of them, is Ahmad Monsour. He's not a member of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. He's an award-winning human rights defender in the United Arab Emirates. And because he's a human rights defender in a country like the United Arab Emirates, the government really doesn't like what he does. Now, back in August of last year, Ahmad received these two SMS messages. And for those of you who read Arabic, they purport to show evidence of torture in UAE prisons. So being a human rights defender in the UAE, he might have been tempted to click on them. But he didn't. Instead, he forwarded them to us at the Citizen Lab for analysis. Now, when our researchers looked at this, Bill Marzak in particular, he immediately recognized that domain. He had been tracking the infrastructure of a particular commercial spyware company. He had mapped out most of their domains that they were using, some of them anyway, and so he was waiting for an opportunity like this, and when Ahmad forwarded the messages to them, he immediately recognized them as belonging to the infrastructure of a company called the NSO Group. Now, if you Google NSO Group right now, you probably won't find anything except information about our reports in the Citizen Lab. And that's by design. This is a company that operates largely in the shadows. They bill themselves as a cyber warfare company. They're Israeli-based. They're formed by veterans of Israel's signals intelligence agency, Unit 8200. So they are very, very capable. They're among the best in the world at this sort of thing. And they sell, like most companies, they have some caveats. They say, well, we only sell to governments and we follow Israeli and local laws, which is certainly true. And I'm going to return to that in a few moments, so maybe keep that in mind. Now, had Ahmad clicked on those links, he would have been drawn into the NSO's infrastructure and to some pretty powerful capabilities. They would have been able to get inside his iPhone, basically monitor all of his telephone calls, look at all of his text messages and emails, even those that are encrypted, because they are actually looking through the device. They would have been able to turn on the audio and the video, capture ambient sound in a room, so effectively turning your iPhone into an eavesdropping device, and most importantly, track his movements through GPS, through geolocation. The attack was very sophisticated. At the heart of this company's product offering were 3 separate unpatched vulnerabilities on the iPhone. Now, for those of you who don't know this area well, those are called 0 days, meaning the software vulnerability is not even known to the vendor yet. These are very rare. They're also very expensive. If you remember the controversy between the FBI and Apple over the San Bernardino case, you recall Apple was being asked by the FBI to help them get inside that device. There was a long battle, and eventually the FBI went out and paid a company to do it, reportedly around $1.3 million. So these 0 days run on the order of about $1 million each. This particular exploit chain had 3 separate Apple 0 days. So it gives you an indication not only of the level of sophistication here, but the lengths to which this government would go to get inside this particular human rights defender's phone and monitor what he was doing. So as soon as we realized that we had a set of 0 days involving Apple, we did a responsible disclosure to Apple. We received those SMS messages on August 11th, and a report was published to be co-timed with security patches to all Apple devices August 25th. So that tells you how quickly Apple moved to issue patches, not just for iOS, but for Safari, the browser, and OS X as well. So that was an update affecting approximately 1 billion Apple users worldwide, which is pretty phenomenal as a researcher when your funders of your research often ask, what is the impact of your work? And we say, well, affected about 1 billion people, which is pretty cool. But more seriously, I think it's remarkable that Apple worked so quickly on this, and that whole process was an interesting one. Now, you may have asked yourself, well, how did Ahmad Monsour know to forward those text messages to this university research lab in Canada? Well, it turns out that Ahmad, we had worked, this is the 3rd report we did with Ahmad, all of them involving commercial spyware companies, 3 separate ones, going back to 2011 when we were first introduced to him. He received an email that had an attachment that was laden with malware, that time from a British company, Finfisher. Then 2012, Hacking Team, an Italian company, was being used its services to try to get inside his computer, and then most recently the NSO group. Now, as far as we know, he is the only person to be targeted by his own country using the services of 3 separate commercial spyware vendors. So for that reason, we called the report the $1 Million Dissident, because it's unprecedented. Now, there's a bit of a sad coda to all of this. Eventually, the government decided, well, forget digital surveillance, we're just going to go apprehend Ahmad. And about a month ago, he was arrested. He's still in jail, unfortunately, and no one really knows his situation. So while we were doing this report, the researchers, looking through the infrastructure and doing some scanning of news and so on, came across a reference to some Mexican-related targeting. So this is a Mexican journalist, Rafael Cabrera, and he had tweeted that he had received these text messages that looked suspicious to him, and one of our researchers actually managed to find this by searching through Twitter. And so we contacted him, and it turns out that he was also targeted by the NSO group, this time in Mexico. He's an investigative journalist that was covering scandals involving the Mexican president and the First Lady over their lavish White House mansion. And we, with all of our reports, we publish what we call indicators of compromise. So we'll take like those domain names, any other data we have, we'll publish in an appendix at the end of the report. And we did it in this case, even though we knew there's some kind of vague Mexican connection here, we didn't really follow up until about, maybe it was about 6 months later, I think. We heard from some civil society groups in Mexico who had received outreach from Access Now, which is another civil society group, saying there were a bunch of health scientists in Mexico who were receiving suspicious text messages with the domain names that were listed in your reports. Could you take a look? It turned out that there were several scientists who were being targeted with the very same NSO group infrastructure. In this case, there are health scientists in Mexico who are advocating for a soda tax. Now, this is the craziest thing. In Mexico, sugary beverages, consumption of sugary beverages is a real problem, and you have these health advocates, anti-obesity activists who are arguing, who are advocating for a tax on soda. And you would think, like, who could be against that? And at first we thought, well, maybe we found Donald Trump's 400-pound hacker. But in fact, in Mexico and in many countries, the sugary beverage industry makes a lot of money, and there are a lot of corrupt politicians and government agencies that have a stake in it. And so they really wanted to get inside and neutralize this campaign. One of the people, we were able to retrieve his phone and look through all of his text messages, and I show this just simply as an illustration of the lengths to which whoever was behind this, and we don't really know which agency of the Mexican government it was behind this, took to try to convince him to click on those links, which thankfully he did not. So you see there are messages about court cases, maybe these involve you, you're being sued, there are papers that mention you, even some really rude ones I won't get into about his wife and so on. Here are the pictures. The last one, which I've blown up here, which I thought was really remarkable, said, Mr. Simon, your daughter was just in an accident. She's in grave condition. I hope you can come. Here is where she is hospitalized. If you think, how many of you receive that text message wouldn't want to click on that? I mean, this is really playing upon the fears, sense of urgency, and so on. If you want to read more about it, this strange story was covered on the front page of the New York Times back in February. It goes to show that even health advocates, that segment of civil society, are being targeted with this very advanced $1 million spyware. In fact, over the last 5 years, we have dozens of stories like this. Journalists, lawyers, human rights workers, humanitarians in just about every part of the world have been our patient zeros in these type of Citizen Lab reports. And that has really underscored to us there is a serious problem going on here. Now, I know some of you may say, well, maybe there's a selection bias going on because Citizen Lab, you're a well-known human rights organization, people turn to you, so you're looking at only the cases that come to you that are very serious in nature. Well, that's not necessarily the case, although we're not able to see all of civil society. A few years ago, we published the results of a 4-year comparative study that we did involving about 10 non-governmental organizations that signed on to this study. Over that 4-year period, they shared malware samples, emails that they suspected were laden with spyware. We analyzed 2,800 pieces of malware, 44 distinct malware families. We interviewed them, so it was combined with contextual research. And the main finding of this study, among other things, there were several findings, but the principal one for me was we found that, first of all of these organizations had been compromised without them knowing about it. And secondly, the very same threat actors that we hear about in the news, targeting industry, private sector, Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, had infiltrated these very same organizations. The key differences are that unlike those Fortune 500 companies and government agencies, it's never talked about in policy circles. And secondly, most of these organizations have very little capacity to deal with the problem. They can't go out and hire a very expensive cybersecurity company to go in and fix the problem. They're really left hung out to dry. Now, I mentioned that the very same threat actors that we hear about infiltrating and targeting industry and government had got inside some of these organizations. One example of that, very notorious example, a couple of years ago, one of these security companies, Mandiant, published a report about a Chinese cyber espionage group called APT-1, which was associated with the People's Liberation Army. And this was quite a controversial report because the people behind the espionage, the individuals inside the PLA, were actually named in the report. And the United States government took a pretty dramatic step to actually indict them. So if you go to the FBI site, you can see their pictures now. These people are indicted. If you look at the actual indictment, it talks about theft of intellectual property, attack on government and industry, but nothing about the attacks on civil society that we had published about and documented involving those very same groups. After that indictment came out, President Obama and President Xi had a summit where they reached a celebrated agreement on cyber norms. They said, look, let's agree that we will have some areas of cyber espionage that are out of bounds. One is involving attacks on critical infrastructure, and the other is attacks on industry. Again, however, no mention of civil society. After this summit and agreement came out, many in the industry published graphs like this saying, actually, we've noticed a big drop, a big decline in attacks coming from China on private sector and government. Well, I can tell you, even though we don't have full visibility into all of civil society, we do track a lot of targeted espionage campaigns coming out of China. And I can tell you, based on our experience, we've noticed no drop whatsoever. In fact, I think there's been an increase. And part of that may be due to a kind of informal green light that was given to the Chinese government to say, hands off this area that matters to us, but when it comes to civil society, feel free to do what you will. Of course, over the last year, we can't escape discussion around Russian cyber espionage into the DNC. It's been all over the news, and certainly the Russians, I believe, I feel that there's firm evidence that they were involved in getting inside the DNC, hacking John Podesta's email. What's often overlooked, though, is that for the Russians, the motivation, the security threat that they see when they look out into the world is as much about what other governments are doing on the one hand and maybe getting inside and strategically gaming with the United States, as it is about civil society, as it is about protecting regime stability, neutralizing journalists, human rights activists, and NGOs. So overlooked in the reporting around the time of the DNC was the fact that the very same operators that had tricked John Podesta, got inside the DNC, had used the very same tricks to get inside of the networks of Open Society Foundations, which is major funder of human rights work. It's a funder of the Citizen Lab. They got inside Open Society's internal network, stole information related to grants and other organizations that are funded by Open Society Foundations, and then changed the information to make it appear as if Open Society Foundation was funding Alexei Navalny, who's a very prominent Russian opposition figure. So for the Russians, their threat model, their motivation to engage in cyber espionage is at least as much about civil society as it is these other threats that we read about in the newspapers. And in fact, if you look, this is an industry report published about a week ago that analyzed in detail the Russian cyber espionage group that is affiliated with the attacks on the DNC. And you see there, they have about a third of these, of the victims that are civil society targets, NGOs, authors, journalists, political activists, etc. We don't hear about them, however, in the reporting. As we go through our research in Citizen Lab, we've observed there are at least 3 separate forms of targeted attacks. And I think most people are familiar or associate cyber espionage with the big nation states, with the United States, Russia, China, Israel. You have the second category now, commercial spyware, which we are seeing all over the world. And I think what's interesting there is that you don't have to have the internal resources and capacity of a national security agency to effectively have your own very sophisticated cyber espionage. You can go to a company like Hacking Team, Finfisher, NSO Group, and simply purchase it. And many countries are doing this. And then there's finally a third category, which is, I call my cousin can hack. And this is where we're seeing governments essentially using the techniques of cybercrime to do the same thing as the very sophisticated commercial spyware or nation-state organizations. And the reason is, in order to do the job, you need just enough technical sophistication. It's all that you need, as long as it works. So, for example, we published a report on a cybercrime network that had been operating. We were able to map it out over 8 years across South America, targeting journalists, civil society, and opposition members, but not using very fancy Apple 0 days, and certainly not having resources of a nation state, but effectively using very simple remote access tools and Trojans and viruses that are part of the cybercrime underworld. Likewise, in Syria, we published 5 separate reports where different actors are kind of piling on to this conflict, whether it's ISIS, the Assad regime, the Syrian Electronic Army, groups operating from Lebanon or Iran. But again here, it's not sophisticated technology that's being used. It's not something out of a Jason Bourne movie. It's rather tricks that are designed to get inside people's devices. And as long as it works, it's effective. I'll give you an example from a report we published a couple of months ago about a major phishing campaign in Egypt targeting human rights advocates and lawyers who are defending human rights advocates in Egypt. This is a good example of the type of thing I'm talking about. There was a prominent Egyptian human rights lawyer, a woman, who was arrested, and within an hour of her arrest, many people in her network received this email. And it said, "You've received a new document in your inbox about the arrest warrant against Aza Soliman." And I think many people, especially if you're colleagues or friends, might be tempted to click on that. If you did, you'd come to this fake Dropbox sign-in, which is essentially designed to harvest credentials and passwords, get inside your inbox, and use that method to map all of the people, send other emails as well, and effectively neutralize the groups. And you can see from the domain, it's not the legitimate Dropbox domain, but many people with a sense of fear or urgency, emotion involved, might not stop to actually look at that. Now, when you look at civil society as a whole and scan the sector, I think there are reasons to be really alarmed because of the nature of civil society right now as it relates to digital security. What we found in our research, first of all, generally speaking, you have very low IT capacity. Most civil society organizations barely have someone that can plug in the printer, let alone deal with the adversaries that we're talking about here. There's a lack of basic policies and security practices. It's just not part of the routine of most non-governmental organizations. Devices, networks, software, often insecure. In many cases, not even updated or patched with the latest software. Especially in the developing world, many groups use pirated software, or they can't afford to update software. And so they're exposed to very old software vulnerabilities that can be used, old days you might call them. Digital security threats are not always salient. So if you're in a war zone and you're dodging bullets, trying to convince that person, hey, maybe use two-factor authentication, it doesn't seem like an immediate threat to them relative to what they're facing. There is a lot of folk wisdom being passed around that's actually misinformation. People saying, use this tool, you'll be safe. Or, don't use Apple, use this or whatever. And most importantly, we're finding across the board that attacks are disrupting work, safety, trust. It's as if sand is being thrown into the machinery of civil society. And this is what really concerns me, because if you recall, at the beginning of the presentation, I was talking about this conventional wisdom people had for many, many years, that information technology is empowering civil society. And indeed it did for many years, but now we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing people pausing and not sharing information, suspicious of attachments that they're receiving. There's a culture of paranoia that's slowing everything down and undermining the network effects, the very network effects of the technology. I also think things are going to get a lot worse rather than getting better, and I'll explain why. First of all, there's a general problem that affects all of society, including civil society, and that is we are connecting at a pace that far outstrips our ability to secure ourselves. And this applies to everyone. With the Internet of Things, Sean Smith, I think, is here somewhere. The research that he does here at Dartmouth, I think, is very much about this. The number of platforms, applications, standards, protocols, developers, the rate at which all of this is happening and things are being connected to the Internet is simply happening too fast for us to secure ourselves. We've really got a structural problem, and I don't think there is any simple solution to it. But what makes it worse is the role of governments. Many governments are actually making problems worse by the way that they treat software vulnerabilities. Many governments don't want to publicly disclose them because they use them as weapons of warfare and intelligence. This is about the NSA and whether it discloses software flaws. We heard recently in the news about this in the CIA because somebody, some insider perhaps, had taken a lot of their weapons, their software toolkits, gave them to WikiLeaks, and now they're all in the public domain. I can tell you that is like a preview of what we in the Citizen Lab will see targeting civil society groups in the developing world about 6 months from now. Somehow this mindset has to change, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But right now, I think governments are actually part of the problem rather than the solution. And the United States is the only country that actually admits having a process at all It's called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process. I don't know of a single other country on the planet that will even admit that they have any type of process, that they harbor or disclose vulnerabilities with some consideration to the public good in mind. Secondly, I think that we are living in an age right now where covert action is on the rise, and it has to do with the nature of deterrence at the international level around cyberspace. So in this area, if you follow the news, you hear a lot of concern about digital Pearl Harbor, or maybe there'll be a cyber attack between Russia and the United States and North Korea. As much as that's a remote possibility, and these days you have to kind of entertain that with the leaders that are in power in a country like here and in North Korea, the reality is that just because countries have weapons doesn't mean they'll deploy them. So just like as in the nuclear area, in the cyber area, there's significant deterrence. There's restraint. You don't want to unleash these very powerful weapons for fear of the consequences. So there's a kind of rational deterrence against using them. But of course, governments have a lot of resources. And so what's happened is it's channeled a lot of that energy into the covert domain. A lot of energy and effort being put into misinformation, into psychological operations, and to cyber espionage. Related to that is the fact that, generally speaking, democracy is in retreat and authoritarianism is resurgent. So back 20 years ago at the end of the Cold War, when we had this remarkable transition away from communism, many people assumed there would be a flourishing of democracy. And if those of you might remember this famous book by Samuel Huntington called The Third Wave, where he said that, look, we're now in this period where we're going to see democracies replacing authoritarian regimes. Well, basically now the picture is very much reversed. We're seeing countries sliding back into authoritarianism. This is the World Freedom of the Press Index from Reporters Without Borders, and you can see based on the red and the orange, when it comes to press freedom, situation's not very good. They had this section here, which I thought was really interesting, the danger of a tipping point in the state of media freedom, especially in leading democratic countries, is really a problem. And nothing seems to be checking that fall, they say. The obsession with surveillance and violations of the right to confidentiality of sources have contributed to this continuing decline. I should note one other thing. The Economist, hardly a left-leaning journal, before the election of Donald Trump had downgraded the United States to a flawed democracy in its democracy index. So worldwide, we have a problem. Governments are losing accountability mechanisms, sliding back into authoritarianism or, frankly, autocratic regimes. And that means their primary security threat is not other governments. It's keeping the regime in power, much like the case of Russia and China. I think also there is an ironic consequence here of the Snowden disclosures, a normalization of mass and targeted surveillance. I spent about a year helping the Canadian media decipher the Snowden disclosures, so I had the privilege of looking at both published and unpublished data. I invested a lot of time. I thought this was a very important public policy issue. And at the end of it, I don't think I can point to a single policy change in Canada that is an outcome of those disclosures. And I think, in fact, you could argue that what they have done is put out, ironically, because this was unintended, a blueprint for many countries as to how you conduct mass and targeted surveillance and enlist the private sector in that effort. So there's been a normalization of this after the Snowden disclosures. And then lastly, as you can see from the research, I hope, there is a real problem with this unregulated spyware industry with proven abuse potential. As part of the research that we've done in this area, I wanted to highlight a couple of things where we've been able to essentially build global maps of the clients of some of these companies. The research around this is really ingenious. This is taking network measurement techniques that are normally used to look at how traffic flows on the internet and how robust networks are how software communicates between clients and servers. The researchers were able to reverse engineer the malware that's used by these commercial spyware companies, and in some cases identify who the clients were by using this global mapping. For this project, we mapped every single internet-connected device using a technology called ZMAP. And here's the map. So you can see there's an Italian company, Hacking Team. Most of the government users of this technology are among the world's worst violators of human rights, even though the company says they only sell their technology for legitimate law enforcement purposes. Well, is it any surprise? Because for many of these countries, law enforcement has to do with domestic repression. Here is the same type of project, in this case involving the British company Finfisher, and again, it's quite a disturbing picture. We haven't done the same thing with the NSO group, but we did produce this map, which is about the domains that are associated with countries in their exploit infrastructure. And again, it's a pretty troubling picture there of countries that have bad track records in human rights. We also know about the abuse of the commercial spyware industry thanks to leaks and frankly, stolen information. So after reading one of our reports about Hacking Team, there was a hacker somewhere who was outraged. And although I don't condone this, what he did was hack into Hacking Team's own databases, stole all their information about their corporate company details, and posted it on WikiLeaks. And so you can go through the emails now that they're in the public domain, and you see this company who, when they're asked by the media, they'd say, oh, we have a board of human rights lawyers that vets every purchase, and Citizen Lab is only looking at marginal cases. Well, that's actually a complete fabrication. They're very earnestly going out to find clients in some of the world's most human rights abusing places. We also found this email, which I thought was very interesting. A little anecdote here. So in our reports prior to publication, we'd, as a matter of practice, send Hacking Team a letter. I would author it on behalf of our research group saying, we found evidence that you've sold, your technology is being used to monitor journalists in Ethiopia. Let's say, what do you say for yourself, and we'll publish it in full. So in the email archives, we came across the CEO saying, is there a way that we could hit Citizen Lab hard? I'm not qualified to assess the feasibility of any legal action against CSL. Nevertheless, I love having a few options if they exist. For those of you who are interested in this particular area, Al Jazeera just published a documentary, aired a documentary called Spy Merchants, where they set up an investigative journalist to pose as a front buyer for countries like Iran, Sudan, others like that, and captured on video the reactions of some of the company executives. And so you see here a person responding, first, we are okay with Iran. Of course, it's subject to export restrictions, but this is something that we can manage, no problem. And then the bottom one, this is a Chinese company saying, we don't know who is the end user, and we don't care. We have done it before. So the whole 45-minute documentary is full of vignettes like this. Seriously, though, there is a very big problem with this unregulated spyware industry, which, again, another ironic consequence of the Snowden disclosures. After the Snowden disclosures, a lot of the companies, Google, Facebook, et cetera, beefed up their consumer security, offering end-to-end encryption, which has driven up the market for lawful intercept products that get inside devices. So what do we do about this? I'm going to end with some suggestions, beginning with some immediate steps in the short term and then some long-term considerations. So the way forward, I think, first of all, we need many more examples and illustrations to raise awareness of this problem and put it on the radar of policymakers and citizens worldwide so they understand there's a problem to begin with. And that requires coordination and collaboration. I hope you can appreciate from the talk that Citizen Lab doesn't do this alone. We're embedded in a community of human rights advocates, local experts, civil society groups in just about every region of the world, as well as industry people who maybe share information with us, give us access to data feeds. So it's a community that's addressing this problem. It's not us acting alone. And I think more of that can be done. Frankly, I don't know why there aren't more citizen labs in other parts of the world doing what we do. I wish there were. I think industry could do a lot more to protect users. The technical researchers on our team will tell you that if two-factor authentication were required by default, and that is, you sign on to something and then you're given some other credential through a second independent means, maybe through your cell phone. Some of you might know this when you log into a bank or maybe to your Google services. If that were made mandatory for all users of digital technologies, it would really frustrate the threat actors that we're dealing with. It wouldn't solve the problem. In fact, we have published reports on Iranian threat actors trying to trick their way around two-factor authentication. But it would do something. And I think industry has to take on some responsibility here. Civil society, which is a large segment of society, it depends on their technology. They have an obligation to step up. There are many things we could do around applying existing criminal law, civil law, even trademark law against some of these companies, as well as refining export controls. Unfortunately, the debate around how to control spyware has really narrowly focused on export controls, and people get cynical very easily when they see, oh, this Italian company was able to bypass Italian export controls, must mean it's just a Wild West as the only alternative. I don't think that's the case. If there are instances where someone is illegitimately targeted by one of these companies, in many jurisdictions, that's a violation of wiretap law. You could actually, somebody could be held criminally liable for that, whoever's responsible for it. And there's a case in the state of Maryland right now where an Ethiopian journalist who was the focus of one of our very first reports, being represented by EFF, is taking the government of Ethiopia to court, suing them for the surveillance that he experienced. Many of the companies use fake product schemes, like they try to trick you, as you saw, the Dropbox image. Dropbox, other companies could hold those companies liable for copyright infringement. So there's a lot that could be done here to rein it in. And lastly, I think we need to think about this from the perspective of civil society as a behavioral issue, as a whole of civil society issue in the way that we think about health issues. Unfortunately, because it's a technical area, a lot of the people who work on this advocate for specific tools. They say, if only you use this encryption, it would solve things. And I think technology is part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution. If you look at a lot of the ways that people are compromised, it has to do with behavior. It has to do with social engineering. It has to do with tricking people. And the fortunate part of that is there are ways that you can then educate people on what to avoid, how to look at suspicious emails, maybe don't click on attachments. Encouraging and educating people around digital hygiene, I think, has to be part of the solution. I think there's a role for university-based research groups here, obviously. And given my experience, I think interdisciplinary research is key here. All around the world, I hear about interdisciplinarity spoken about, but rarely practiced. And I think Dartmouth is, from what I can see, an exception to that, especially the Neukom Institute, but this is very rare. I think we train people, especially as they move on into graduate school, in silos. So you go through engineering degrees and maybe you have one course on public policy or ethics, and you go through a social science degree, you have no experience in technology and coding. And I think that really needs to change. We need to overcome the disciplinary boundaries to address this issue properly. The university, of course, has special skills, resources, can act as a bridge to industry and civil society. And I think in ideal terms, it's a place where, a safe place, a harbor, for controversial research to be protected. And that's certainly what the principle of academic freedom and tenure is about. Here, I'm a bit concerned in terms of what I see as infringements on academic freedom with both corporate and government intrusions into research through funding mechanisms, non-disclosure agreements. A lot of the national security agencies are funding cybersecurity research. Students are going through programs and are not allowed to actually speak about what they're doing or publish what they're doing. And I think that really stands at odds with the heart of what a university should be about. Now, in terms of the big picture, I think the challenges here are much larger, so this is long-term. I really do believe we need to reframe how we think about cyberspace. I put here as a global commons. I don't think, technically speaking, by the definition of the term, it is a commons because most of it is owned by the private sector. But putting that aside, I think we need to think about it in the same way we think about the natural environment. That this is something that not only do we depend upon for everything that we do, but is actually essential to the long-term survival of the species. We need to start encouraging stewardship over the digital ecosystem. And that extends to how we train young people to think about the technology. It's perverse to me that at the very same time that we're surrounded by so much technology, it pervades just about everything we do, we are discouraging people from lifting the lid on that technology. If I take apart this iPhone, it's called jailbreaking. That to me is emblematic of the problem. We need to instead be encouraging a curiosity about what goes on beneath the surface of the technology, encouraging people to exercise stewardship over the digital ecosystem. And that can only come, I believe, if we start treating a lot of the cybersecurity issues not as military issues, but as civilian issues, as something analogous to a public health approach. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, solutions to cybersecurity now have been essentially delegated to the men and women in uniforms. And that's not to say that they don't have an important role to play, but I think there's something upside down and counterproductive to having the world's most secretive agencies involved in essentially governing and securing the space that the rest of us communicate through. And I think we're eventually headed to disaster if we keep going down that road. And that will take, of course, a collective mindset change along with institutions, practices, law, and ethics. And I think this is something that will take not 10 years, but generations to come. However, I do think there is an urgency right now in dealing with this problem. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions now and discuss with you your thoughts on this presentation. Sure. Yeah.
So questions for Ron, anyone?
Yes, I think there's a microphone here for.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. The Citizen Lab is a great global example of this kind of work. I'm wondering, you focused specifically on targeted attacks with activists in civil society. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how larger platform social media companies or even commercially available apps fit into this ecosystem of threat, because I think, you know, so you have both the kind of large-scale hacking of companies like Sony, but also sort of dubious apps. I'm thinking this week of Face app, which is a very, you know, I don't know if any people have seen this. It switches your face between genders. It makes you look older or younger. And from what I've seen, comes from a very sketchy company that is not talking about where this data is going at all. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that broader ecosystem.
Well, I didn't talk much about an area of research that we work on, which has to do with precisely those issues. We spend a lot of time analyzing, unpacking applications, a lot of them based in China, and I can explain why in a few minutes, to understand what's going on, first of all, what's happening with them. And I think it's interesting that to be able to do that, there are techniques, methods that can be used, reverse engineering, I think is one of those techniques that potentially is under threat, depending on the copyright that's involved, or the licensing, or the jurisdiction within which it's done. But to me, it's an essential public service. We're entrusting so much information to these companies, and the clients that we use to interface with them, the applications, they're the gateway to those companies. And a lot of what they're doing, how they structure what we can see, what we can communicate, what they do with the information they gather from us, is hidden beneath the surface of the application. So holding the algorithms to account is a public good, and it needs to be defended rigorously as a public good. What we found in China, and the reason we've chosen China, first of all, the scale of the market is unbelievable. So you have our last report we did on a chat application called WeChat, something like 800 million monthly users. That is enormous. Like, this is a major user base. And what we found in the experiments we did was there's keyword filtering going on in a quite sophisticated and nuanced way. So if you send a keyword related to a particular person that is sensitive in the China context, it may get through fine. But if you put the name of that person alongside reference to some recent social protest, then it won't get through. And you're not given any notice. So it simply doesn't appear on the recipient's device, which is really insidious, because you have no idea that this was filtered at all. We also found in that recent report that they're filtering images, and we've yet to determine exactly how it is. That's the first time we've seen image censorship on this platform. So if you post an image, it might go through, it might not. I think this is it's a huge issue, and it's a global public policy issue. A lot of us are using applications that are developed in jurisdictions outside of which we have control as citizens and consumers. And that's a big problem. I see, yes, over here.
I was a little interested and perhaps perturbed to hear you dismiss industry as basically wanting to target you for ads, when quite frankly, the nexus between industry and government is so close that there often is, in many countries, no separation at all. Those in power are in power, whether it's industry or government. And the organizations you've mentioned with the for-profit spy agencies clearly can't be functioning without the cooperation of the governments in those states in which they reside. So the Israeli government, clearly the Italian government, and so forth, obviously have a role to play in the function of those industries.
Yeah, I'll just respond quickly. I think you're right. This market, let's take the Israeli case, the NSO group, that company, they are entrepreneurs that are veterans of the Signals Intelligence Agency in Israel, Unit 8200, which is their NSA, but it's unique in terms of the character it has encouraging that type of business entrepreneurism. So the reason that you have a lot of Israeli companies that are at the leading edge of surveillance, facial recognition, voice recognition, is that they're veterans of this unit. So the marketplace wouldn't originate were it not for countries like that. And the same goes for the United States. Many hundreds of billions of dollars are used to acquire this technology. So it creates a very profitable marketplace. And then once that market is saturated, naturally the businesses look elsewhere. And that's what we're finding is it's now enabling autocratic regimes to maintain their rule.
Shona, back. No, in the corner, Shona. No.
A point of information and a brief question. The point of information, speaking at Harvard's Kennedy School for Government, a New York Times national security correspondent, David Sanger, said that Mr. Podesta and his colleagues had been instructed about a year before the hack happened to implement two-factor identification. Mr. Podesta decided not to do this, and he was one of two people who took that decision. My question is, you have spoken of social engineering as the vector for these various exploits. Is that because it is the principal vector, or are there other modus operandi?
What we find is that social engineering is the principal method. It's the royal road to compromise, and there are better versions and terrible versions, and some groups put a lot of effort into it. To this day, we see a lot of China-based threat actors using very unsophisticated, spelling errors and things like that. It's not quite, on the level of I'm an investment banker from Nigeria, click here, but still lots of errors. But then we see some that are, the example that I showed you from Mexico, I think is at the far end. So this is really trying to desperately get someone to click on something and escalating emotion, escalating fear, accurately describing the person. And in the Egyptian case, another example, someone arrested, sending to the colleagues, this is a copy of the arrest warrant. That's pretty sophisticated. And that the idea here is to simply get you to click on something or give over your credentials. And as I said, the fortunate part of that is I think the solution to it then is behavioral. If you can educate communities on what to avoid, you can make some progress. I'll give you an example. We've worked going back now to at least 2009 with Tibetans. We did a report on the Dalai Lama and cyber espionage back then. And the Tibetans, I would say, are canaries in the coal mine because they've been at the sharp edge of Chinese cyber espionage attacks for many, many years. They started a campaign called Detach from Attachments, which was a kind of play on the Buddhist spiritual advice. But it had a deeper technological meaning because most of the attacks back then occurred by people sharing attachments. And they have these really cute videos that they circulated to try to encourage people not to click on attachments. It worked for a while, but then the Chinese threat actors modified their approach, started using links instead of attachments, credential phishing, and that sort of thing. Yes, down here. George?
You mentioned...
There's a microphone.
Let the mic, I'm sorry, recording, thanks.
you mentioned that you wish there were more places like Citizen Lab. And are there things specific to Canada that make Citizen Lab possible and thrive? The funding or the social environment that make it more difficult in other countries?
I don't think so. I think you might think that, but I don't have any evidence to support it. Most of our funding, with very minor exception, comes from U.S. foundations, from MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, and in fact, many of my staff are Americans. They work remotely. Some live in New York, Berkeley, whatever. We do a lot of collaboration with other universities on some of the core technical work. So I don't think it's been that. I actually think it has to do with the fact that I'm a political scientist and a lot of the work is technical in nature. I think if that could be duplicated, it requires I think it's less likely if it's the opposite case. And I've talked to a lot of people in computer science and engineering in my school and other schools, and there is a bit of a risk aversion. I think part of it has to do with the pressure to graduate students to find jobs. And I've been told by some of my colleagues that, the work that you do is great and there are many interesting problems for them to work on, but what if they want to get a job in China? Or what if, they're doing research and a company doesn't like it? So there's a bit of risk aversion there. And I think also there's a framing of the problem in technical ways that someone like me coming at it, what I saw was, geez, these techniques that are being used to reverse engineer malware or to measure network traffic, we could use them to identify the vendors of spyware. That is inherently a political question or a political economy question. So I think that's the key, is to have someone who's a maybe non-computer science engineer spurring something on. At least I tell myself that. Otherwise, I'd be out of a job. Yes.
It's interesting that biology contains examples of both mimicry and camouflage, and biology contains examples of the importance of distinguishing self from non-self, such as immunity and so forth. So to what extent is biology a useful example for your work, or a false promise for your work?
That's a very good question, because the area is replete with metaphors and analogies from biology, so viruses and things like that. To me, I think to the extent that this relates to biology, the mindset that we have to encourage people to adopt when addressing the problems has to do with a kind of public health analogy. And in the same way now that it's considered inappropriate to just not wash your hands, or when you're cooking in restaurants we kind of take it for granted they'll have proper hygiene practice. I think we need to start thinking about that as a societal obligation, as a norm. Yes, Denise.
Well, just on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I like the analogies of public health, but we don't just rely on norms there,
That's
right?
true.
We have health
Regulation.
agencies that come in and evaluate, and then a different analogy I think of sometimes is sort of the growth of automobiles, and as a technological, device introduced, and I don't want to have to know how to fix my car to know that it's safe. And because, so it took time, but we established standards.
Yeah.
We had skilled professional associations, both governmental and non-governmental and industry, who evaluate those things. I can take it to a mechanic and find out whether something is safe or not.
Yeah.
And that's a different analogy that could work.
Yeah.
And I study healthcare, so I know the limits of public health, so I'd
Right.
maybe prefer the auto industry or something like that. But I just wonder.
You need an auto expert to come in and
Right.
say, oh, it's a bad analogy.
Probably, but the sort of as an analogy, like what are the institutional
Yeah.
structures we need to put in place
Yeah.
to build that infrastructure to get the hygiene or whatever,
Yeah.
the safety.
Yes, sir.
Last question. Yeah.
Thank you. Just picking up from where my fellow audience member left off. Full disclosure, I work for a software company and a computer scientist and an engineer. And my family kind of thinks I'm nuts because we have retreated into a digital fortress kind of mindset, especially these last 6 months.
Yeah.
So there's VPN, two-factor authentication. The thing is that how far do you go with this protectionist kind of mentality? And you made this important note early on that the pace at which we are progressing is outpacing our ability to keep up. So a particularly dystopian view would say that we can't really wait for a generation for laws and ethics and the equivalent of CDC, Center for Disease Control, to be established. So the urgency that I'm feeling is that we need to, this level of education and awareness needs to happen now and on a much larger scale. So is there hope, or is my dystopian view out of whack?
Yeah. Well, I think to me, again, this is maybe the political scientist part of me, I think the solution set has to involve multiple layers and multiple communities and webs of constraint going on, and different epistemic communities shifting and moving them in this way instead of that. And so there are many pieces of the puzzle. But if you look at, for example, just the issue of governments hoarding knowledge of software vulnerabilities, using them as weapons of either warfare or intelligence or law enforcement, there's one issue. I think that's a fair issue that we can all debate and have a proper, mature debate about, and maybe there are some times when they do need those capabilities, but there needs to be a fair, equitable process around it. Is it okay that they have knowledge of, how to take down an airplane and they can just keep that to themselves? Or should they disclose that to the vendors of the airplane system? I think as a frequent traveler, I'd like my government to disclose that, So that's one small public policy issue. And as much as I can, I try to advocate for those little pieces. We have to take it piecemeal. I think the alternative here is it gets very discouraging because you start forecasting and you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. We're going to end up disaster, and that I don't think we'd be able to solve the problem. It's a lot like climate change in that regard. I think you have to start somewhere and not get discouraged.
Let's end on a hopeful note. All right. Ron, thank you.